What is a color revolution? How does it work? Who is behind that? There's a name, Gene Sharp. He's the one that actually created a playbook for color revolution. It was called a Nonviolent Revolution Playbook. This person was on the ground in 1989 in Beijing during the Tiananmen event. And he actually explained, he wrote a specific book on how to overthrow a government. So there's a process. There's an approach, it's a step by step. So he has a holistic approach on how to get to a point where you can overthrow a government. So you have many institutions, many elements that makes a color revolution. And usually, most of those revolutions are led by the West, by the US. And also the EU is also very often behind those color revolution. There's a name, NED, which is a National Endowment for Democracy. That's the rebranded name for the CIA. So basically before, those operation of overthrowing government was done by the CIA, and this was overtly. So it was hidden. And then what happened is that there was a transition to do it openly under the rebranded name of NED. So in terms of marketing, it's much more, sellable. You can justify having NED on the ground, say, well, we are promoting democracy. But in reality, it's not democracy, because when you have foreign NGOs that are working to place a government in your country, that goes against democracy, because democracy is a process of self-determination. It's going against a country's sovereignty. So you can see there's an example, for example, in Ukraine, the Maidan Revolution. That Maidan Revolution started a long, long time ago. It's about planting the seeds. When did they plant the seeds? Actually, already after World War II, the US had this Gladio operation. Gladio operation was recycling Nazi agents for meddling into a country's affair. So one of them was actually Stepan Bandera. He was actually recycled by the US, and he was working on the ground and ultimately was killed by the KGB in Germany. Then we got to a point in Ukraine in 2014 where they managed to overthrow the government. But you see, it's a process since 1945 till 2014, planting the seeds for color revolution. And it's very, very gradual. You need to prepare the minds of people. You need to indoctrinate the people. The US, according to Victoria Nuland, had spent $5 billion to hijack Ukrainian democracy. So usually what happens is that when you have a revolution, what happens is that there's always a legitimate grievances of people. And slowly what those Western agents do is to hijack movement that at the beginning is legitimate. Give you an example, Ukraine, it started with protest pro-EU and also protest against the oligarchy, against the corruption. So what they did was to hijack the movement, and slowly you had violent minority that took over. And they were actually, killing people. What happens is that in the case of Ukraine, you had Georgian snipers that were hired probably by the CIA, which were shooting both sides. Because in a color revolution, what they want to do is to create martyrs. Once you have martyrs, then you can write a story and try. You can actually manipulate people emotionally. You have other entities like you have the NGOs, the Open Society of George Soros. Who's George Soros? He's a very greedy hedge fund manager that has been doing speculation against currency. One of his achievements, or big steal I would say, is that he attacked the British pound and actually made billions out of it. So what is it for him? Because people never ask the question, is into this open society of regime change. What is it for him? In reality, when he managed to overthrow a government and put a puppet, George Soros takes a share of the looting. So, and then they go through a process of what they call liberalizing the economy. But what is liberalizing the economy is basically how are we going to buy state-owned assets, very valuable state-owned assets for a penny. So I have an example of what one of the success of the open society is that at some point in Burma or the present Myanmar, they managed to put a US puppet in power. Her name was Aung San Suu Kyi. So right after she took power, what they did was to, alongside with the NGOs called Asia Society, they did a task force. And in that task force, that paper it says openly How are we going to share the wealth of Myanmar? So that's how George Soros operates. It's not philanthropy. It's about ultimately to create this open society, just one world order, new world order, controlled by the globalist elites, the multinational corporation. But it's also for him just to make a lot of money whenever he managed to overthrow a government with these friends, NED, the CIA, and other regime change NGOs. Then you have also the EU. The EU actually is getting more and more involved into regime change. There's one of those NGOs is called German Bolle Stiftung. That is an NGO that is close to the Green Party, and it's actually very active in Thailand, for example, and in Southeast Asia. There's also USAID. USAID actually operates a bit differently. They actually operate more into developing countries, very poor countries, and actually they have a niche into humanitarian aid. But in reality, it's not humanitarian. Actually, if you really dig into what they do, is basically manipulation of elections and investing into what they call the civil society. Basically, it's foreign meddling. Then there's money to be put in the education system. You see, for example, there's the endowment fund of Jaroslav Hunke, this ex-SS Galicia Nazi that was expatriated to Canada by the US. Well, what he was doing was to give money to universities that were covering Ukrainian studies. So when you give money to those universities for those studies, you are going to manipulate history and just make sure that they are going to teach the history you want them to write. So they do revisionism there. You have also the media. I mean, those fake media, that are actually not reporting news. They are actually doing propaganda. Some of them are Reuters, AFP, Associated Press. Those are all tools of intelligence agencies that actually are very active whenever there's a regime change operation. They also, what they do is they also invest into political leaders. Many leaders or candidates are chosen by the West, and they try to plant them into those countries where they want to do regime change. Some examples, Juan Guaido. You have plenty of those agents. Navalny, exactly. Navalny is one of the examples for Russia. Those are all co-opted by the West, and they want to put puppets there not to work for the countries they were elected by, but they are going to work for the US. So in the system of co-opting, you have also in allies of the US, for example, France. France, you have Macron. Macron was actually pre-selected by the globalist elites. He was identified by Attali as someone that is working for the World Economic Forum. And he's actually an alumni of the foundation, French-American Foundation. That French-American Foundation, if you really look at the goal of that foundation, is to advance U.S. interest around the world. So you have a president that actually, in France, that actually has gone through an entity which is exclusively working for U.S. interest. Additional to that, so he's an ex-Rothschild banker. So we have to ask the question, is he still working for Rothschild, or is he doing the revolving door? And then also it's very important to see that just 2-3 years before being elected, he went through the vetting system of Bilderberg. So very often, if you go to Bilderberg, you actually, almost de facto are going to be the next president. We have many examples like this. You can check on Wikipedia. There's a list of attendees of the Bilderberg group. And most of them, for example, Bill Clinton, when he was governor of Arkansas, he went 2 years before being elected. He went to the Bilderberg group, and then he was elected. And you have a list of attendees that you can check, and you'll see very often that's the last vetting system. So then they also invest into the school education system. If you can actually indoctrinate kids at early stage, then you can prepare the ground for the next color revolution. So we had this in Hong Kong. They had invested into trade unions, but also the teachers' unions. So the whole education system was hijacked by Western interest. So you had books before the national security law that was enacted in Hong Kong. You had books that were teaching kids to hate China. up to the moment in 2020 where China enacted a national security law. So you see, this is where we see that national security laws are extremely important, because you need to protect the country against foreign interference. And also it's really important to see when we are talking about sovereignty is not only a border, it's not a physical border. Now you have social media, you have information space. When you look at the Western social media, those ones also tools of the intelligence agencies. There are lots of FBI, CIA agents that have been hired by Facebook and Google, and they are working closely with the CIA for regime change operation. So it's a very complex system, but there's a playbook and there's an escalation system, and they adapt the system according to the country. And again, it's additional to that, you have this soft power that comes in the form of Hollywood. So this is why you have countries that actually have some firewall, like China, but because they know, because they were already attacked. China was attacked many times, was attacked in 1989 in Beijing. Behind that was the West. They want to, what they call democratize China, but in reality it's not. It's about hijacking a democracy. China was attacked through Tibet. There was a Tibetan independent movement. They were actually armed, they were armed by the West. The Dalai Lama was actually financed by the CIA. Then you had the ETIM, the terrorists in Xinjiang. They wanted to be separatists, and they wanted to actually, they did actually terrorist acts in China. Then you had the attempt of color revolution in 2014. There was the Occupy Central in Hong Kong. And then again, 2019, as clearly regime change attempt in Hong Kong. So this is why it is extremely important. What those countries need to do in order to protect themselves is to enact national security law. Because again, the West is actually saying we want democracy for those countries, but it goes completely against the idea of democracy. And it goes also against the UN Charter that says clearly that you should not meddle into other countries' affairs. Democracy, again, is a process of self-determination. No sovereignty, no democracy. So whenever we analyze a country, we need to look at first, is sovereignty respected? Do you have armed troops in your country, like Germany, like Italy, like Japan, like Korea? If you have tens of thousands of troops, then you don't have democracy. Do you allow NED to work into your country freely? No. But if you allow that, but you don't have a perfect democracy. So this is why, for example, we see in India has been moving towards actually banning those fake NGOs, thousands of NGOs that were there for a long time. And very often what happens is that it's a type of gladiator operation for all those ex-colonies. When they leave, the colonizer leave, they plant the seeds to still control the country. This is what we call neo-colonialism. It's more subtle, but it comes into the hijacking of democracy. And that's what we have for example, in India. And that's why actually the President Modi has been kicking out thousands of those fake NGOs that were planted there since the independence of India. So again, we need to pay attention. Whenever we analyze a system in a country, we need to pay attention first at sovereignty. Is sovereignty respected or not? That is the foundation. Because if we respect the country, if we are really for democracy, well, we should first have the precondition for democracy. Number one, sovereignty.